What if the most important weapon America has built in decades just quietly crossed a major finish line and almost nobody caught it? Somewhere inside a heavily secured facility in Texas, engineers just wrapped up work on a nuclear weapon 3 months ahead of schedule. That single fact should be sending tremors through every defense ministry on the planet right now. Before we go further, do one thing. Hit subscribe and tap the like button. Not because I asked nicely, but because what you're about to hear will completely change how you read every headline about Iran, Russia, and China for the rest of this year. Share this with someone who still thinks nuclear weapons stopped evolving after the Cold War. They haven't. Let's get into it. Let's start with the plain facts, because this story gets distorted online within minutes of any nuclear news breaking. The weapon is called the B-6113. It belongs to a long-running family of American nuclear gravity bombs stretching back several decades. And in mid-2026, the agency responsible for maintaining America's nuclear stockpile confirmed something genuinely remarkable. Every sensitive internal component scheduled for completion this year was finished 3 months early. Not delayed, not stalled, early. That announcement landed quietly. It didn't dominate news cycles the way missile strikes or troop movements tend to. But people who study nuclear weapons programs professionally immediately understood what they were looking at. This was not a minor bureaucratic checkbox. This was one of the fastest nuclear development timelines the United States has managed since the Cold War era, when the entire nation was effectively organized around building these things as quickly as humanly possible. Here's the detail that makes this story impossible to ignore. This isn't happening in isolation. It's happening while American aircraft are actively striking targets inside Iran. Command centers, radar installations, supply lines along the coastline. A live military campaign is unfolding in real time. And right in the middle of it, news breaks that a brand new nuclear weapon just hit a production milestone ahead of its own already accelerated schedule. Coincidence? Almost certainly not exactly what it appears on the surface, but also not something you can responsibly wave away as meaningless noise. The truth sits somewhere more complicated and considerably more interesting than either extreme. So let's slow down and actually understand what this weapon is, why it exists, and what its very existence tells us about how the next several decades of global power are going to be shaped. First, let's kill a myth before it spreads any further. This is not a signal that the United States is preparing to drop a nuclear weapon on Iran. There is no public evidence this specific weapon has been assigned to any active target list in the current conflict. Nothing ties it to the Strait of Hormuz. Nothing links it to any particular underground facility inside Iranian borders. If you've seen headlines suggesting otherwise, they're stretching the facts well past what the actual evidence supports. What this really represents is something bigger and in many ways more unsettling than a single strike plan. It's a message about how American military planners are thinking years and even decades into the future. Specifically about adversaries who have decided the safest strategy is burying their most valuable military assets deep underground, behind reinforced concrete, protected by layered air defense systems, betting that sheer depth alone will protect them from anything except a nuclear weapon. The B-6113 exists to make that bet considerably riskier. Now, here's something that genuinely surprises people when they first encounter it. This program didn't start because of Iran. It didn't start because of any single crisis at all. The Pentagon first publicly revealed the concept in late 2023, well before the current conflict ever began. Officials described it at the time as a measured response to a security environment that had been gradually shifting for years, not a panic reaction to any one event. Defense leaders have stayed remarkably consistent on this point ever since. The decision to build this weapon came from years of quiet observation, watching how much money and effort rival nations were pouring into digging their most critical assets deeper underground, watching how seriously other governments were investing in hardening bunkers, command centers, and missile storage sites against the kinds of conventional weapons America already fields in enormous numbers. In other words, this weapon was built because other countries changed their defensive strategy first. And that's a pattern worth remembering because it appears repeatedly throughout military history. Now let's clear up some language, because getting this wrong completely changes how people understand the broader story. You'll see this weapon casually labeled a tactical nuclear bomb in a lot of online coverage. That description is misleading, and it genuinely matters. The broader B-61 family has included both smaller tactical versions, designed for use closer to a battlefield, and larger strategic versions, meant for far more consequential missions. The B-6113 specifically falls into the strategic category. It's certified for delivery only by strategic bomber aircraft, and it will be stored domestically rather than forward deployed overseas, the way some earlier, smaller variants were. Under American nuclear doctrine, that placement tells you almost everything you need to know. This isn't a weapon designed to be slung under a fighter jet and used on a frontline target the way a conventional bomb might be. It belongs to the careful, deliberate category of weapons meant to influence entire wars, entire governments, entire questions about national survival. It sits firmly in the deterrent tier of the arsenal, not the battlefield tier. There's another term that trips people up too. Gravity bomb. That phrase sounds almost quaint, like something from a black and white newsreel, but it simply describes the delivery method. The weapon is dropped from an aircraft and falls under gravity rather than flying under its own propulsion the way a cruise missile or ballistic missile does. Don't let the simple name fool you into thinking this is some crude, unguided device from a previous era. Modern gravity bombs, including this one, carry sophisticated guidance systems. The B-6113 inherits many of the same precision and safety features developed for its immediate predecessor, including a modern steering tail kit that dramatically improves accuracy compared to older unguided designs. And accuracy might matter more here than in almost any other category of weapon in the entire American arsenal. A weapon that lands precisely on its intended target doesn't need to rely on sheer explosive size to compensate for a wide margin of error. It can concentrate its destructive force exactly where planners need it instead of spreading uncertainty across a broader area. But don't mistake precision for safety. This is still a nuclear detonation. Extreme heat, massive overpressure, ionizing radiation, potential radioactive fallout depending on conditions. None of that disappears because the guidance system improved. Precision changes where the weapon lands. It does not change what the weapon fundamentally is or what it does to everything within its effective radius. Now for the number that tends to grab everyone's attention immediately. Public reporting places this weapon's warhead design close to an older, higher yield variant within the B-61 family. Outside analysts who track these programs closely estimate the upper range of its potential yield somewhere in the neighborhood of a few hundred kilotons. Some estimates suggest it could be roughly 20 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. Take a breath with that number for a moment. 20 times. But before your imagination runs too far ahead, there's something crucial to understand. The government hasn't published an exact maximum yield figure, which is fairly standard for weapons in this category. Any specific number circulating online should be treated as an informed estimate, not an official confirmed fact. And here's something even more important that frequently gets lost in the shock of large numbers. Multiplying explosive energy by 20 does not mean multiplying destruction by 20 in a straight line. Terrain, altitude of detonation, weather, the specific height of the blast, and the structural strength of nearby buildings all shape real outcomes in ways that don't scale simply or predictably. That said, let's not undersell this either. Even accounting for all those variables, a weapon in this yield range could still devastate an enormous military complex and cause catastrophic damage well beyond its immediate target zone. This is not a weapon to minimize or exaggerate. It's powerful. It's also far more complicated than any single headline number can actually capture. Let's talk about the science, because understanding it changes how you see this weapon completely. This is not simply a larger version of the Hiroshima bomb. That earlier weapon worked through nuclear fission, splitting heavy atoms apart and releasing the energy stored inside their atomic bonds. Modern high-yield weapons like this one are thermonuclear. They use a fission explosion purely as a first-stage trigger, creating the extreme pressure and temperature needed to ignite a second stage involving nuclear fusion. Fusion is the same basic process that powers the sun, except here it's released in an uncontrolled fraction of a second, rather than unfolding gradually over billions of years. That two-stage design is precisely what allows a modern weapon like this to produce vastly more explosive energy than the comparatively simple atomic weapons of the 1940s ever could. Its particular combination of compact size, guided precision, and adjustable yield is exactly what makes military planners view it as strategically significant in the current threat environment. Now here's the question everyone eventually asks. Can a weapon like this actually destroy a deeply buried military facility? The honest answer is complicated and resists the simple version most people want to hear. The B-6113 isn't publicly described as a dedicated Earth-penetrating bunker buster. That specific role belongs to a related weapon, the B-6112, which does include Earth-penetrating capability. But even that weapon can't simply drill hundreds of feet through solid rock the way movie scenes suggest. Earth penetration runs into brutal physical limits almost immediately. A weapon hitting the ground at high velocity experiences enormous structural stress. Push that speed too far, and the weapon risks destroying itself on impact before it can function. Don't penetrate deep enough, and a large share of the detonation's energy simply escapes upward and outward instead of concentrating underground where it's needed. So does that mean a nuclear weapon is powerless against a deep underground facility? Not exactly. Even without directly reaching an inner chamber, the shockwave from a nearby detonation travels through surrounding rock and soil. It can collapse tunnel entrances, sever ventilation and power systems, crack structural supports, and bury critical equipment under tons of rubble. In practical terms, that can functionally disable a facility even if the deepest chamber technically survives the initial blast. Delivery matters just as much as the warhead itself, and this is where things become genuinely fascinating from a strategic standpoint. The B-61-13 is expected to be carried by the B-2 Spirit and eventually by the B-21 Raider, which is currently entering active service. Both aircraft were purpose-built to penetrate heavily defended, contested airspace without being detected. That stealth and range combination gives a bomber-delivered weapon something no missile can truly replicate, no matter how sophisticated its guidance system. Here's why that matters so much. A bomber can be launched as a deliberate signal. It can be held on station for hours. It can be turned back before any weapon is ever released. All of this without irreversibly committing to an attack. That flexibility makes a nuclear-capable bomber two completely different things at once. A physical weapon and a political message folded into a single aircraft. That dual nature sits right at the center of how this entire category of weapon actually functions in the real world. Now, let's talk about deterrence properly, because it's the real engine driving everything we've covered. The entire purpose of a deterrent weapon is to manufacture uncertainty inside an adversary's mind. And that uncertainty does most of its real work long before any weapon is ever actually used. Think about it from the other side for a moment. A government pouring enormous resources into building a deep underground bunker has to seriously ask itself whether that bunker is actually deep enough anymore. A commander relocating critical assets underground has to ask whether those assets can genuinely survive an American strike under worst-case conditions. Deterrence works partly through fear, but equally through sustained doubt. An adversary doesn't need to know precisely how or when a weapon like this might be used. It only needs to genuinely believe that the capability is real, that a credible delivery platform exists to carry it, and that a president could plausibly authorize its use under sufficiently extreme circumstances. That belief alone changes behavior. It shapes where countries build their most important facilities. It shapes how deep they dig and how confident their leadership feels about their own survivability. All of that happens without a single weapon ever leaving American soil. Here's the part of this story that almost nobody is talking about, and it might actually be the most important piece of the entire picture. This weapon is not an isolated project. It's one of 6 separate warhead modernization efforts currently running in parallel across the agency responsible for America's nuclear stockpile. And according to that agency's own public reporting, every single one of those 6 programs is currently tracking ahead of its projected schedule. Sit with that for a second, because it's not a small detail. For decades following the Cold War, America's nuclear production infrastructure was widely described, including by government auditors, as aging, understaffed, and barely capable of maintaining the existing stockpile, let alone developing new capabilities. Facilities fell behind. Expertise thinned as older engineers retired without enough trained replacements. The entire system slowed to a crawl for nearly 30 years. A production enterprise, now finishing 6 modernization programs simultaneously ahead of schedule, represents a completely different institutional reality. It points toward a genuine systemic recovery that foreign intelligence services and defense ministries worldwide are almost certainly monitoring just as carefully as this individual weapon. Step back and look at the complete picture together. A weapon finished ahead of schedule. A production agency hitting 6 modernization milestones early simultaneously. A stockpile that isn't growing in total size, but is quietly becoming more accurate, more flexible, and more capable of reaching at targets that once felt completely untouchable. A retirement plan already underway for the largest gravity bomb America has ever fielded, and all of this unfolding quietly in the background of an active military campaign that most of the world is watching through the narrow lens of daily airstrike headlines. That's the real story here. Not a single bomb, not a single conflict. A quiet, methodical rebuilding of capability that has been unfolding for years, largely outside the public spotlight, until a moment like this, one briefly drags it into view. And here's the question worth carrying long after this video ends. When a nation spends years quietly rebuilding its most extreme category of weapons, not necessarily to use them, but to ensure every adversary believes it could, what does that tell us about the world we're actually living in right now? Nuclear weapons rarely get used. Their real power lies entirely in what adversaries believe they might do. The B-6113 will probably never be dropped on any target, but its existence already changes the calculations of every government that ever considered burying its most important secrets deep underground and trusting that depth alone would be enough to keep them safe. That belief, quiet, invisible, and impossible to measure precisely, may end up reshaping global power far more than any single airstrike ever could. If this video helped you understand something you hadn't fully grasped before, subscribe and share it with one person who needs the complete picture instead of just the headline version. Drop a comment telling me one thing you learned today. I read every single one.